Freshwater Protection Director at the Nature Conservancy, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I wish I could be in Stockholm with our on-site presenters and panelists, but I'm really happy to be here with our online audience, and I am grateful for those of you who are choosing to spend part of your Sunday with us at your computers. For those who are online, I would encourage you to participate actively by putting your questions and comments in the chat, and I will be feeding as many of those questions to our on-site facilitators for our Q&A sessions as I can. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge and thank the organizations that came together to design this session today. Those are the Nature Conservancy, WWF, IUCN, Wetlands International, Conservation International, and Synchronicity Earth. Now, these organizations and others have been working together for some time now, first to elevate freshwater ecosystems in what ultimately became the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and since the framework's adoption, to work on implementation of the framework in the world's rivers, lakes, and wetlands. For those of you who might be less familiar with the Global Biodiversity Framework, or the GBF, as some of us call it, it's been hailed as a landmark agreement to guide global action on nature through to 2030. If you've maybe only heard a little bit about the GBF, you might have heard of the 30 by 30 target to protect 30% of the planet by 2030. But there's a lot of other things in the GBF that are relevant to freshwater systems, and I expect we'll be hearing about a number of those today in addition to that 30 by 30 target. The GBF, the framework, was finalized and adopted at the 15th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD, in December of 2022. There are 196 countries that have ratified the CBD, and so that really speaks to the potential reach and influence of the framework when it's implemented. Today, we're going to explore how the Global Biodiversity Framework is relevant to freshwater ecosystems, or inland waters in CBD speak. And we're really going to be focusing in on how the water management community can help to implement those targets, help to achieve those targets, and really ask the question of why the water management community should be motivated to do that. Just to give you an outline of our session structure today, we're going to start with 3 presentations to provide some context and provide some concrete examples. So we'll begin with an overview presentation by Joaquin Harlan of UNEP, and then we're going to go into 2 presentations, one by Sophie Tremollet of the Nature Conservancy. She'll be talking about how the GBF touches down in Europe. And then we'll hear from Mariana Nava from WWF, and she'll be discussing some innovative financing solutions for GBF implementation in the Mexico context. Then we're going to have a facilitated Q&A, so save your questions from those 3 speakers. That Q&A is going to be facilitated by my colleague, Sabrina Upadhyay from the Nature Conservancy. Then we'll shift gears. We're going to have a facilitated panel discussion. That discussion will be facilitated by James Dalton of IUCN, and we're going to bring in 3 additional expert voices with different perspectives. So we'll hear from Mark Smith from the International Water Management Institute, or IMI, Julie Malonga from Wetlands International, and Dominique Gattel from Veolia. James, again, will facilitate that discussion. There should be time for Q&A, I hope. And then James is going to transition to some concluding remarks and next steps. I am really excited about the speakers we have with us today. I want to thank them right now, in case I forget to do that later. I'm really looking forward to hearing their perspectives on this topic. With that, I would like to invite our first speaker up to the stage if he's not already there, and I will introduce him. This is Dr. Joaquin Harlan from UNEP. Joaquin is a water resources and international development professional, manager, and leader with a more than 30-year-long career spanning the areas of international policy, business, and organizational development, and all forms of water-related projects.
Recording in progress.
Currently, he's heading up both the freshwater unit of the UN Environment Program in Nairobi and the UNEP DHI Center on Water and Environment in Copenhagen. He serves as UNEP's representative on UN Water, and he leads its expert group in support of Agenda 2030. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Joaquin.
Thanks a lot. I started my presentation. I don't know if it's beamed up.
I see it on my screen. There we go. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you here in the room, and welcome to everyone online. So I've been introduced, so I won't go into that. So the idea with my initial talk here is just to give the background, the overview of the targets and actions that are relevant to freshwater or inland water, and related services and what we can do around this topic. So first of all, if we look at the Global Biodiversity Framework, just a quick overview. We have 4 goals, 23 different targets. And the first goal here is very focused on the ecosystems themselves and the species. The second goal B here is about the sustainable use of our ecosystems and biodiversity as such. Goal C is here on the benefits and benefit sharing. Equity aspects are included there, and then goal D is a little bit about the means of implementation, including funding. Now, we're very pleased to see that freshwater is prominently in this framework. We worked quite hard to make that happen. And here are some of the relevant targets on freshwater related to the threats to freshwater biodiversity. So you can see here in Target 1, all areas are under participatory and effective management processes is very relevant also to freshwater. We see Target 2 that at least 30% of areas of degraded terrestrial inland water and coastal and marine ecosystems are under effective restoration. If we look at Target 3, 30% of terrestrial and inland water and coastal and marine areas are effectively conserved through the protected areas and other effective area-based measures. These are targets directly related to freshwater. We can also see that there are a number of other targets, and I would say that there's a lot of interconnectedness in this framework that also relate to us and the work we're doing. So the reduction of invasive species, of course, is very important. Addressing pollution and the loss of habitats, the impact of climate change. And we can continue. We can look at the aspects of agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries, and forestry that they manage sustainably directly impacts also on freshwater biodiversity. We can also look at Target 11 and not the least Target 12 here, which talks about connectivity, and that's very important aspect in freshwater, as you know, with migratory species moving up and down and ensuring connectivity in waterways and the like. I was also asked to say a few words about how this global biodiversity framework is linked or supports and is also being supported perhaps also through other mechanisms like the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's, of course, very strong interlinkage here. We can see it to SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation. We can look at, of course, obviously, and not least 661, Target 6. We have on SDG 15 on terrestrial ecosystems. We also have it in climate action in SDG 13, clear interconnectedness. We have it on the marine side, on life below water, as we say here in SDG 14, and also in SDG 17 in terms of how we can take action and use partnerships and also engage broadly to realize the framework. We see it linking also to a number of UN conventions. I won't go into all the details here, but obviously on climate change, on drought and desertification, transboundary waters, and the Ramsar Convention on wetlands as well. And these conventions can also provide a framework for international cooperation and can help us, as I've written here, to help us implement the Global Biodiversity Framework also. We'll be talking about that. Now, how do we go about moving this forward at the national level? So we have what's called NBSAPs. This is the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. And they were also part of this accelerator partnership that was signed in connection with the agreement of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and its design, or the intention, is to help countries fast track and upscale the implementation of these national biodiversity strategies and action plans, NBSAPs. So they provide a framework for countries to take action and conserve, protect and conserve biodiversity. They also are intended to help countries to identify the key threats and set out actions to address them. And they also intended to be cross-cutting and linking into decision-making processes within countries. So there's a mainstreaming thinking in this, and I think we will be discussing some of that today. So we don't address these issues in isolation. And on timelines, this can vary from country to country, but CBD recommends that there's an update of these NBSAPs every 5 to 10 years. Financing and how we can support this, a few words around that. So financing is something that each country has to mobilize and decide on how to tap into, but there are a number of vertical or international funds that are also looking into this field, of course, and the GEF has this as a focal area for many years. Now on the question of how we in the water community can contribute, and so I'm wrapping up a little bit around that. So we can support by providing information on the status of inland waters in a country, and related to biodiversity, of course, identifying key threats to these waters and their biodiversity. We can support also in helping countries to both raise funds and also with technical assistance to implement the NBSAPs. And we can also work to raise awareness of the importance of inland waters and freshwater biodiversity and the need to conserve them. These are some examples. There's more, and I'm hoping that we today will talk more around this topic on how we can take action to advance the NBSAPs. And that's how I just wrap this up. So I think I'm even ahead of time, but I put a couple of links there. And thank you very much, and back to Robin.
Thank you so much, Joachim, for providing us an overview of the Global Biodiversity Framework. If you have questions for Joachim, we will be taking questions after 2 more presentations, and this will be from either the online audience joining us today or also all of you here in person as well. So hello everyone, my name is Sabrina Upadhyay, and I will be co-facilitating today's session. And I am the Freshwater Community of Practice Manager at the Nature Conservancy. I have the pleasure of inviting our next speaker to the stage, Mariana Nava. Mariana Nava is a biologist from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. And she has a master's degree in restoration ecology from the Faculty of Science, UNAM, and a PhD in environmental sciences from the State University of New York and Syracuse University. Her research line focuses on the study of water-related ecosystem services and environmental flows, which she has developed through national and international interdisciplinary projects. She is a visiting professor of the Faculty of Sciences at UNAM and has joined WWF in 2017 as a freshwater senior officer. Since 2019, she's led the Water Reserves Initiative that WWF is implementing in Latin American countries. Please help me in welcoming Mariana.
Thank you very much. for this invitation. I'll be very happy to talk a little bit about how to implement the global biodiversity framework for inland waters using the Mexico's case study. A little bit of the pathway that Mexico has been using in the last years to restore and conserve freshwater ecosystems. So before I start with that, I would like to give you a quick overview of what is the Freshwater Challenge. The Freshwater Challenge is a country-led initiative that was started at the Ramsar COP. Then it was carried into CBD in Montreal, and then it was launched at the UN conference in New York by the countries you can see there: Colombia, DR Congo, Ecuador, Gabon, Mexico, and Zambia. Other countries like Canada, France, Finland, Germany, Romania, the Netherlands, Singapore, and US attended this event at the political level and committed to engage in the initiative. So basically, the challenge is very simple. It is a mechanism to realize the global biodiversity framework aim to bring under restoration by 2030, 30% of degraded inland waters globally. This equals to 350 million hectares of degraded wetlands and 300,000 kilometers of river. If we achieve those restoration targets, we will also be helping countries to deliver on adaptation plans, and basically we are providing multiple solutions to many other conventions. So what are the objectives of this challenge? One of the main objectives of this Freshwater Challenge is to align and harmonize freshwater restoration and conservation into those other commitments, for example, NDCs, adaptation plans, Ramsar's, SDGs, particularly SDG 6, Water for All. And so what we need is more partners to be part of this challenge. All UN countries are encouraged to join the challenge to contribute to the global goal, and what we need is to adopt quantitative commitments on freshwater ecosystems restoration or conservation within existing commitments to promote policy coherence across sectors. This will improve planning, measuring progress, and harmonize reporting, and of course, mobilize resources to accelerate this implementation. So, having said this, what has Mexico done today that can help chart a path to meet these three main steps, examples, I would say? First, we have this big initiative, the water reserves. This is a science-based allocation policy that Mexico implemented in 2018, with which it was possible to conserve around 55% of the surface water of the country and the water needs of around 40 Ramsar sites and 60 protected natural areas. This is an important water conservation strategy, preventive strategy, that we are replicating now in Latin American countries. Second, the creation of multi-stakeholder platforms for ecosystem restoration and river monitoring. We have, for example, the Alliance for Ecosystem Restoration. This alliance is a national alliance through which we are developing the roadmap to comply within the GBF, particularly Target 3, the implementation of, we are implementing this alliance, and through this alliance we are implementing or trying to find the route towards complying with the Target 3 of the GBF. So we also have another national network, the Water Reserves Monitoring Network, with which we are developing a national river monitoring system for monitoring system in rivers. And last but not least, we've been exploring financial mechanisms, and we are about to start a financial mechanism in the peninsula, the Yucatan in Mexico. And the name of this project is Yucatan Vive. So this is, PFP stands for Project Finance for Permanence. This is a project that is part of a larger ambitions collaboration with TNC, Pew, SOMALAB, and WWF. This is an initiative called Enduring Earth that seeks to protect and conserve our planet's ocean, lands, and fresh water, but also securing long-term financing for conservation. There are already several PFPs around the world. 6 of them are led by WWF. The Mexican PFP is called Yucatan Vive. We have different partners in this project. We have TNC, WWF, but most importantly, we have the Yucatan government involved in this project. The goal is to strengthen effective management, equitable governance, and financing to conserve key ecosystems in the Yucatan Peninsula and to contribute to sustainable and resilient livelihoods of the communities that inhabit the protected natural areas. This is where we'll be operating the PFP. We will be operating in the Yucatan Peninsula. So the largest partner is the government of the state of Yucatan. We are going to work with 9 state natural protected areas, all the coast, the Ring of Cenotes, and the Puc Reserve. The second partner is the government of the municipality of the city of Mérida. This is because we are going to work with the Cuxtal Municipal Reserve. One of the interesting things about this municipal reserve is that it is called the lung of the city of Mérida, but most importantly, from this natural protected area comes 40% of the water that is supplied to the city of Mérida. Our third partner is the Zapotal, which is administered by a local NGO. And this is important because it's because of its biodiversity. And just to finalize, this is the finance model, how the PFP will deliver resources. We have 2 phases. We have the planning phase and the implementation phase. And basically, we are at the moment of the planning phase, which includes the conservation, the financial, and the operational plan that is in the developing process. And the idea of this PFP is to fill the gap of funding that is not provided by the existing state funds that are already secured. And I think I'm running out of time. Okay, well, I think I still have a couple of more minutes. But yeah, I mean, if you have more questions about this, I mean, you can reach me out at any time. And one of the important things about this PFP is that the enabling conditions, political will, conditional disbursement, were the guiding pillar and non-equity fund. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for sharing innovations and financing these GBF targets in Mexico. I'd like to invite our third speaker now, Sophie Trémollet. Sophie Trémollet is Europe's freshwater director for the Nature Conservancy, where she leads the development and implementation of a program to accelerate investment in nature-based solutions for water security in Europe and globally, and then also works on protecting rivers in the Balkans. Prior to that, she worked as a consultant in the water sector and for the World Bank, and she holds a double master's in economics and international development from Paris Institute of Political Science and Columbia University. Please welcome Sophie.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation, and great to see you here. Had to rush a little bit from the airport, so I'm afraid I'm a little bit delayed. So today I just wanted to talk to you a bit more about the targets 2 and 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, their relevance for inland waters, but also how we're looking to implement them in Europe. As Sabrina mentioned, I lead our program for TNC, for the Nature Conservancy in Europe, and we're working across the continent, focusing on protection in the Balkans, but also on nature restoration in countries where nature has been severely degraded, such as the UK and Spain. So just, I mean, you're freshwater experts, but I think it's important to draw out what the importance of inland waters is and why it's been sort of not so much considered so far in the biodiversity targets. The inland waters that we define as rivers, lakes, and other wetlands are rich ecosystems that support biodiversity, livelihoods, and economic activities. Even though they cover a very small percentage of Earth's surface, they have the greatest species diversity per unit area and high levels of endemism. We estimate that they support 12% of known species and more than half of all fish species. This is important because aside from providing ecosystem services, regulation, cultural function, they also provide 1/3 of global food production, which can be key in certain population. And as many of you know, perhaps they're also the biome in which the fall in freshwater biodiversity has been the fastest and the strongest. So since 1970, we've lost 83% of freshwater biodiversity, and we have lost more biodiversity and more species threatened than on land or sea. The habitat loss is a key factor. There are multiple factors for that, but habitat is one of the key factors as it affects 80% of threatened freshwater species. And we have plans for dams, for example, that threaten the free-flowing status of rivers, of 260,000 kilometers of rivers. This is important to bear in mind because we're starting from a very low position. So we've got an estimated 40% of watersheds that are degraded, 37% of rivers that remain free-flowing, which means that all the others are dammed or their connectivity is severely impaired. We've got 87% of global wetlands that have been lost in the past 300 years, and 32% of watersheds that suffer severe water shortages, something that is, as we see it every day, just getting worse and worse with climate change. So in previous approaches to biodiversity preservation, there were a number of challenges. Freshwater, or inland water as we call it now, was not specifically considered. The 2010 Aichi targets, those that preceded the Global Biodiversity Framework that was signed in Kunming-Montreal, did not support the assessment of freshwater biodiversity and ecosystem coverage on its own, particularly because there was no indicator to assess with confidence whether freshwaters within or flowing protected areas were effectively conserved. So we would have terrestrial-driven protected areas, but with no specific consideration of inland waters, which meant, even though we don't have exact figures, we don't have a baseline, that inland waters were underrepresented in the design, designation, and effective management of protected areas or ECMs. So we've achieved substantial progress in this current global biodiversity framework, I think thanks to the efforts of a lot of the organizations that are represented here and that have convened this session. Particularly because inland water has been specifically mentioned in what we call Target 2 and Target 3. So Target 2 being focused on restoration with the target of restoring at least 30% of degraded terrestrial, but also inland water and coastal and marine ecosystems by 2030. And with Target 3 being focused on the protection, again, of 30% of terrestrial inland water and or coastal marine areas, which would be effective through either protected areas or other effective area-based conservation measures. So it seems little, but this inclusion of inland water in those formulations is critical to what can be achieved, and that can be seen as a major sort of victory, if you want, for the community focused on freshwater. So in Europe, there's been substantial progress. It's hard-fought, hard-won progress towards the implementation of Target 2 in Europe. through the current adoption of a nature restoration law. So in a vote, in a very disputed vote in Parliament, in the European Parliament on the 12th of July this year, before the holidays, that is, there has been effectively the repealing of a nature restoration law dropping, if you want. So it's very convoluted, very European institution style, but in effect that means that we currently have discussion underway for its adoption by the end of the year. And it's important because it's implementing, it's drawing into law some key targets that were included in the biodiversity strategy, including, for example, the restoration to free-flowing status of 25,000 kilometers of rivers by 2030. It also includes something that TNC has been, and others, of course, has been fighting for quite substantially, is the creation of a nature restoration fund. Because we spoke earlier about the financing mechanism. The idea is to bring together multiple pots of fundings in order to dedicate funding to nature restoration. In terms of target 3, that could take many different forms. We have a network of Nature 2000 sort of areas in Europe, but we can draw from a vast sort of set of tools, if you want, in order to advance the 30 by 30 target for inland waters, both in Europe and internationally. So we need to be creative. TNC and others have been documenting what systems exist. Sometimes we need to draw on the cultural relevance of some of the water sites, as has been done in the Krupa River, for example, in Croatia. And we have a document that goes through all these existing systems. What we'll need is to establish reliable indicators for freshwater and an accurate baseline in order to understand where do we start, how far are we from 30 by 30. We'll need to develop and apply prioritization tools, and TNC's Europe has been contributing to this by creating what we currently call the TEFOP tool, the TNC Europe Freshwater Outcome Prioritization Tool. You have a link here. It's not currently fully public, but I can make it available to anybody interested, and it effectively enables you to bring together multiple layers of data, including about biodiversity, but also current threats associated with climate change, future threats, and do that at a river basin scale or smaller. So that will be useful for governments and the like in order to identify key priority areas in order to implement these targets that have been contained in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So in summary, freshwater ecosystem integrity is vital for everything that us as environmentalists and the world at large are concerned about: climate mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Freshwater ecosystems are the most affected in terms of biodiversity loss. That's a message that we need to keep making, including in Stockholm, where freshwater biodiversity is not always top of mind for many participants. The Global Biodiversity Framework provides a key opportunity to protect and restore inland water, and we will have to bend the curve on freshwater biodiversity loss, otherwise we'll fail to bend the curve on all biodiversity period. Thanks. Hope I made it. This is my email if you need any further contact. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sophie. So now we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. I'd like to invite Mariana and Joachim to join me back on stage and to take some questions. My colleagues online, Robin Abel and Tara Moberg, are there any questions online that we can start with? Or if anyone here today has a question, just raise your hand, and we have 2 microphones here available to speak. All right, I think we'll start with in person first. I see a hand raised. Yeah.
Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Bo. I just dropped that. I'm a master's student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was wondering, this is a question for you all. For people who are in the water sector I don't mean to sound glib or redundant, but not necessarily for human means, but for ecosystem and natural means, how do you bring up the need for ecosystems and biodiversity in particular when you're dealing with people such as in this conference who really want it for, human rights, right for drinking water, right for hydropower, right for wash and sanitation. So what is basically your argument as someone in the field of why water is a necessity and why it's also a good for humans?
Yeah. Whoever would like to go first. Yeah.
Maybe
Go ahead.
I can go first because I actually come from a WASH background. So I've been working in the water sector for many years and started working in the water and sanitation services, particularly sanitation. So I can definitely see that disconnect, and which is why I was saying, let's bring that message loud and clear to participants in the Stockholm Water Conference who may not be all that concerned at the end of the day about freshwater biodiversity. And one of the ways that the Nature Conservancy does it is really to stress that ecosystem integrity is key to the resilience of watersheds and therefore of delivering services. And we've been able to demonstrate that in quite a lot of locations. We're working in 40 locations on water funds, but we're also supporting many others to do this kind of analysis to demonstrate that if you maintain the integrity of the ecosystem, particularly upstream, for example, of your water supply, then you can actually deliver water services potentially at a lower cost definitely at a lower cost than if you were considering alternative grey infrastructure solutions. So we've done that in Cape Town, we've done that in Nairobi, we're doing it in the UK, for example. There are many examples that we can draw from, and we'll hear perhaps later from Veolia about how they're taking that into their practices. I don't know if you want to add to that.
That was really good. Maybe if I take a little bit of a more meta perspective on this, I think that with the SDGs and SDG 6, we actually managed to bring a number of water topics together under one goal, which we didn't have before. And so if you look through that, you can see that we go through the different elements of water use, and including then in target 6.6 then on the protection and restoration of freshwater ecosystems. And if we look at 6.5 in particular, we have a target on integrated water resources management, which is trying to look at how can we balance the use of water and also protecting the freshwater ecosystems at the same time. It's embedded there. And so I think what we need to do here is try to link these different water uses and aspects. So, for example, I'm very pleased now to see that we've managed to get freshwater into the global biodiversity framework, very, very related then to advancing, for example, target 6.6 in the SDGs. And now we also see water coming into the climate discussions clearly as well. So if we can connect the dots here, I think we're also addressing the question that you raised. Thank you.
Thank you. Mariana, would you like to add anything?
Well, maybe very quick and brief. I think doing this connection requires a lot of work, sensitization, work, advocacy work with the government. In the case of Mexico, for example, in 2018, it was possible a policy instrument that conserved water for the environment and the people. And this was a huge effort made by the government, but still there's a lot of work to do on that. But it is possible at some point. I mean, I think there are good things there.
Awesome. Thank you. We have one question that came in online for all of you. Thank you for the deep overview of insights on implementation of the GBF. Many of the current activities focus on government actions. I'm wondering if you see opportunities or specific roles for other water sectors.
Actors.
Water actors, yeah.
I can
thanks.
go So in the case of Mexico, we have two big networks, and that's the big opportunity for other actors, not only government. We have the Alliance for Restoration, ecosystem restoration, and it is not only for the government, it is actually for other water actors and academia and other NGOs and local partners and communities. That's the idea. And also the other network we have, which is the Water Resource Monitoring System, which is actually developing a monitoring system, river system with communities. So that's, in the case of Mexico, and speaking from my experience, that's the opportunity that you can have to include other actors and not only government.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please go ahead.
Right, yeah, no, this is a good question, and what comes to mind immediately is, private sector and different business interests. We had just recently a big discussion here in this part of the world around overfishing and also how different groups are actually manipulating information around overfishing certain species and the spawning grounds. We also have the problem of connectivity and the migratory species moving up to spawn in the river systems, and we know that this is linked to the discussion on hydropower and energy production. Very important to integrate these dimensions in those discussions. And the same thing also applies to the whole discussion around pollution and wastewater treatment. So it's not just government, but it's also a lot of different sectors in society and the private operators within that, where we have to bring in the biodiversity dimension into the way of thinking. And that goes back to us as consumers as well, I think, so that we should have that awareness in our choice of products, of service providers, to ensure sustainability and the health of our ecosystems and the biodiversity.
Sophie?
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I mean, I think, as we know, water is an eminently multi-sectoral sector. So yes, we need all actors, all types of actors involved. We need collective action, particularly at the watershed scale. I think what governments can do is set directions, identify which areas need restoration, which areas need protection. We will need to prioritize. Also, the targets are, not getting to 100%. So we need a prioritization mechanism in order to identify where are the species at greatest threats, where are the greatest challenges from human pressure, etc. But in terms of implementation, we need collective action, which can be driven also, as well with, private sector, with NGOs being a key sort of link bringing actors together, because one of the very big challenges of collective action is making it work. And we've seen that over and over again. Government sometimes is not the best at doing it, so there needs additional impetus coming from other actors, which could include NGOs, in order to do that. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions online? I see a gentleman over here.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Ricardo Lagos. I'm from Chile. The question is to any of you. Although we welcome targets 2 and 3 of the recently approved convention, the challenge that we have in Chile is the following. We have more than 1,200 rivers. Most of them requires restoration rather than conservation, but still, free-flowing rivers in Chile are in the Patagonia. Since we lack robust legislation, we wonder whether you know of experience that while we come out with a permanent institutional protection of rivers, what do we do in the midterm? Is there any experiences in the EU or in other countries whereby you have a sort of moratoria in order to sort of, if you allow me, just take a picture, nobody moves, and keep the rivers as they are, as while we came out with a robust and permanent institution that protect rivers. So that's our challenge. Yeah, we have the convention. We know what we like to do, but in the short term, where we can rely on actual experiences on a moratoria, and then perhaps on the funding for that. I leave it there. Thank you.
Difficult question.
Who would like to go first?
Well, I think I don't know. I can't say I have a lot of experience, but what we've been doing is we've been working with community groups, and also we have a partnership with Rotary, which we call Adopt a River, to to mobilize local communities and NGOs and other actors, to protect and restore their rivers without necessarily having the legislation in place. But I think we have to, in this kind of context, work a lot very much bottom up. And obviously a lot of awareness raising and communication and education is needed. I think we have a lot also organizations that have local presence, like IUCN, and their networks are obviously involved in this, and I'm sure my colleagues there could say something around that as well. But that would be my response.
Yeah, I think it's a complex question because there is a continuum. I mean, there's a void. I mean, we usually characterize it as a void, restore, protect, and then resilient watersheds, which would be the continuum of interventions that you need to implement at the level of a river, the watershed itself, because not everything should be focused on the rivers. So it's important to have this holistic approach of the different activities that need to happen. In terms of avoidance, I don't know if, the moratoria you're talking about is about hydropower, which is a big issue in Chile. We've had some successes in the Balkans that were traditionally seen as the last pristine rivers of Europe. But there is still pressure, of course, for hydropower development. So I think mapping where this hydropower pressure is, having demonstration case, sometimes it takes, active resistance. I mean, it's a mix of different types of approaches. Some NGOs, some groups are more looking at promoting legislation. Others are more in the direct opposition and resistance. So we need this mix of approaches. In terms of the regimes for protection, as I said, we've been documenting the variety of regimes that exist and picking on what is the key reason for protection. Sometimes it might be the cultural resonance of that river. Sometimes it might be the ecological biodiversity. So it's important to understand what are the key factors that can be drawn upon in order to make it happen in practice. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for this Q&A portion. If you can please join me in thanking our presenters here today. Thank you. All right, so we'll start with the second portion of our session today with a panel discussion. I'd like to invite James Dalton to the stage and introduce himself and our panelists.
Great, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Okay, so we now move on to the panel session. We have about 35 minutes to get through a series of questions. So can I ask the panelists to come up and just take a stand, actually, behind the microphones. My name is James Dalton. I'm the head of the water management program at IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. You've heard it mentioned earlier on this, in the session. I'm an engineer by training, actually, so I'm trained in putting things in the way of free-flowing rivers, not releasing free-flowing rivers. But in doing so, it gives me the chance to understand how to reverse engineer some of those processes. So we'll see how we go. Where is Dominique? Do you want to come down and take a seat as well? So we have a series of questions to ask our panelists, but also we're looking for you, the audience, to be engaged in the process. So we'll have some chance to stop and take some questions from you all as well, and including if there's any questions online. So let me introduce the panel. There should be 2 spots here, actually. It's a bit tight there, Dominique. So let me introduce them. Dominique Gattel, he is the Director for Institutional Relationships at Veolia in their headquarters office. Then we have Julie Malonga, who's the Director for East Africa for Wetlands International. And then we have Mark Smith, who's the Director General of IMI, the International Water Management Institute. Mark is also my former boss, so he will get all the hard questions as well.
That wasn't the deal.
So let's kick it off first with yourself, Dominique, and please make sure you're into the microphones so that everyone can hear through the headphones. So we've heard about the targets, we've heard about the Global Biodiversity Framework. Sophie pointed out very well that the previous process and the HE targets hadn't really delivered for freshwater, and we haven't really delivered for freshwater biodiversity for arguably 40 years, given the statistics. So is that new framework and the targets that it has within it known? Is this about internal awareness raising? Is it about changing practice? What does that look like for you as a company?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Okay, excellent. Yeah, how can I say that? Well, basically, environmental service provision is our DNA. So in a way, whatever the context, we have to make such metrics and targets ours, because otherwise we simply wouldn't exist as an environmental service provider. And so at Veolia, we certainly, it's more than welcoming the GBF. It gives us our compass. On a daily basis, again, we make the 5 IPBES pressure our compass in assessing whatever we do. So we do strive and protect the habitat. We do strive and reduce pollution. We do strive and reduce the quantitative pressure. We do strive and reduce climate change. We have a number of KPIs on that. And last but not least, fight against invasive species. So all that, again, is something we do on a daily basis in any site that we operate. And that means many sites worldwide. Something like for water only 10,000. And what I just said cascades down in a number of, say, concrete actions, which Sophie and previous speakers briefly showed in terms of local environmental action to protect these sites and to use less pesticide or no pesticides and to get away with the invasive species, etc. So, in other words, we're totally aligned with that. That's, again, our almost daily language, even though, I'm not put myself in biodiversity. But something I wanted to get into, sorry if I'm too long,
no, go on.
Is that, and Sophie, it will come as no surprise to you, is the GBF is absolutely fundamental. Yet it needs, of course, a concrete declination at country level. Otherwise, it's never going to fly. The reason why I strongly insist on that dimension is that the targets are at supranational level, they are fully legitimate, but when one needs to broker or strike a balance between sometimes conflicting targets at country level, we need an authority that has the legitimacy to do that. And this is why, and that's my daily job. I spend a lot of time in the EU talking to the EU institutions to ensure that the GBF targets 30% land and freshwater protection, 50% reduction in pesticide risk, and the others, they land into concrete targets, action, and metrics. Again, otherwise it's never going to fly. We're not there yet. As a matter of fact, right now, there's a fierce battle in the EU institutions about that precise thing. Another thing but still, we push for it. Another thing that, how can I say that, might be less known, especially as an audience like you guys, is the national regulators. They will have to apply whatever results of this parliamentary process or legislative process. Fine, necessary, yet they will need to act a lot quicker than they currently do. For today, any project to be approved, to be rubber stamped by the authorities, the regulator, etc., we're talking something like in between 5 to 10 years minimum to do anything. Can we wait another 10 years to basically reverse the trend on biodiversity? I suppose the vast majority of you will say, no, we cannot afford that time, which means that authorization processes have to be much, much quicker. I don't mean that they are illegitimate, don't get me wrong. I just mean that for a number of actions which are known to go in the right direction, there should be a fast-track approach possible at country level. Is there anything I forgot to say? So again, I mean, in terms of Veolia, this is our DNA. We do that on a daily basis and report on it at global level, at headquarter level. Now we are in sort of in the middle of the river for the reasons I just explained. I mean, we need the GBF to cascade into national laws. One thing, how can I say that? One positive thing is that the global citizenry is aware that the change is now. We've done a poll at Veolia asking in 25 countries, representing together half the world population. We've made a poll asking what do you think of the cost of adaptation to and changing our environmental practices to face, amongst other, climate change. And 67% of the world population, they think the cost of non-adaptation will be higher than the cost of adaptation. So citizens, I mean, they understood the picture. Now, there is something which relates to this parliamentary debate, which I just alluded to. Now, they expect more debate in the public space about the solutions. And that's something we shouldn't miss. I mean, we all believe in stakeholder dialogue, etc. It seems that the global citizenry expects more in this area, yet they are ready. With that,
great. No, great. Thanks very much, Dominique. They're important points, and one of them, a few of them, we'll come back to actually over the course of the conversation. In particular, the point on the regulatory side. So, Mark, over to you. So, IMI is it's got it in your name, water management organization, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that your focus is always on restorational protection or those other elements around water management more broadly. So are there challenges to make biodiversity relevant in water management in an organization like yourselves? And what are those challenges and how do you overcome them? Because going to the question from the audience earlier on, if we can't actually figure it out within our own communities of practice, how are we going to make that difference outside our communities of practice? So just what's your take on that?
Yeah, no, thank you. Actually, to start to answer that, I want to build on something that Sophie was just saying, and maybe be slightly provocative at the outset, which is that, you know, it's a real achievement to be celebrated that freshwater and inland waters are so prominent actually in the global biodiversity framework. We know that wasn't the case before, and it took considerable effort, as we've heard about, to drive home that change. But what I've seen today is that the strategy for implementation in relation to inland waters or freshwater in regard to the global biodiversity framework, the strategy for that implementation is a conservation strategy. And that may sound paradoxical, but what Sophie said that I think we need to pay close attention to, she said the key is, a critical component of this is collective action. Collective action across different sectors, bringing in water management, bringing in different types of different sectors, different types of constituencies, and so on. So doesn't that mean that our strategy for implementation of these targets should have at its core collective action strategy? And is there a risk that by starting out with you know, somewhat conventional conservation approaches to that implementation, without making the investment up front to build that collective action approach, the risk is that we set up a pathway, we set up a track that's the same for that we had back in the the targets as they were for 2010. I forget,
Yeah,
there was
the HE targets, yeah.
No, that was 2020.
All right, before that.
The one before that. So 2010, and then 2020, and now the targets we have now. So, and that's not to say that what we've heard today is by any means the wrong thing. That's not what I'm trying to put before you. But rather that at the core of what we're doing should be collective action. And water management, I think, clearly needs to be very, very important component of that. So, for example, in the work that we do at IMI, we do work around environmental flows, around wetland management, in certain contexts, wetland restoration, watershed management, and so on. All of which are very familiar conservation tools, right? And so there's no difficulty in making the bridge between that kind of work and the work that is highlighted in conservation strategies. But we also do a lot of work on circular economy, wastewater reuse and recycling, data and data systems, and I took some notes of this, multi-use water systems, water productivity in agriculture, governance, of course, and gender and inclusion. So aren't all of those also conservation tools? Shouldn't all of those kinds of activities be working and aligned to delivering against the targets that we've seen? And are we going to miss the possibility to bring those into alignment and have those working, have investments into those leveraged for conservation outcomes if we don't have at the core of what we're doing this collective action strategy for implementation of the global biodiversity framework? And in relation to that, of course, there are some difficult topics that lead to real contestation between water management and conservation outcomes related to infrastructure, related to agricultural development and allocation of water for irrigation and so on. But what I think some thinking needs to go into is if, in fact, we have that collective action approach between water management, between those kinds of water management tools that I would advocate are also conservation tools, then you start to get the different sectoral actors aligned and working and talking in ways in which perhaps we create spaces in which we can have more productive, constructive dialogue around those more difficult topics around infrastructure and so on. And then just one final point, and maybe we'll come back to this, but I think one of the barriers to us doing that is the way we talk about the respective mandates that we have and the respective strategies that we use. And the conservation world, which I used to sit in much more closely, as James said, I used to work in IUCN, and the water management world and agriculture and so on, we're oftentimes using different language for the same thing, and that creates barriers. It doesn't create connection. It doesn't create collective action. And the worst culprit for that is let me get this right. Is the this term, which I've seen on the screen today, of OECMs, so other area-based conservation measures, which is most of what the other sectors are doing, and they haven't got a clue what you're referring to when we talk in those terms. So we have to be much more careful about our language and have a much more collective action mindset that will help us build that common language, and then I hope. Better capacity for large-scale societal action to turn these things around.
Yeah. No, great, thank you. Okay, loads of things in there to come back on as well. So we'll go to you now, Julie, and after Julie, we'll go to the audience, just see if there's any quick questions before we carry on. So, Julie, we've heard from private sector and from water management's perspective. Yourself as Wetlands International, how do you take and translate these targets into the reality of work on the ground? And are they useful for you because they give a sense of purpose, or are they challenging because, as Mark said, you're trying to mobilize many actors to deliver against them, but actually they're still quite targeted to a conservation mindset and community of practice. So how do we take them into a broader remit to get more involved, given that the CBD and the Global Biodiversity Framework is structured by countries, but those countries are the ministries of environment. They're not all of the ministries behind that. So how do you take that into practice, and how does Wetlands International do that?
Okay, so thank you very much for that question. I think you're very right. What happens is that these targets are usually housed within maybe the Ministry of Environment. And here we really want to bring the water sector on board. So there still remains that process of actively bringing the water sector players into this. However, I'd like to say I was very happy with the process that happened in Kenya about 2 weeks ago, where they're developing a national restoration strategy. And for once, they brought all sectors on board. So not only the environmental sector, but also the water sector, the NGOs, the private sector. So everybody was actually on board on this, because it's realized that these targets are actually we're actually focusing on target 2 and 3. But to be able to actually reach where we want, we also need to address the drivers. And these drivers are actually housed within the other targets. So to be able to reach where we want, then we have to bring other sectors on board, land use and so on. So that process where we are bringing all those sectors on board, that process still needs to happen. And then also recognizing the fact that when you look at let me talk about Africa. When you look at some of the freshwater systems within Africa, some of the iconic ones are actually transboundary. So you look at the Zambezi, you look at the Nile, you look at the big wetlands, the Sud and so on. All these are transboundary. So we're actually talking about sectors, but at the same time, we also have to start looking at a landscape approach where we're engaging different countries in this. And this is where also the regional bodies then become important. So you're not only talking to the countries, but you're bringing the regional bodies who can then help you to take these actions to the next level. And then, of course, as Wetlands International, what we are actually looking at is these landscape approaches, bringing all these different countries on board. For example, we have this program called the Source to Sea program within Eastern Africa. We are looking at 2 different landscapes. We are looking at the Rift Valley and we are looking at the Nile Basin. And we feel that's how we can upscale some of these actions. So moving from pilot-based approaches to actions where you're looking at a much broader level. I like what one of the speakers said before. So you don't really have to focus on what's happening only within your country, but actually connecting that to what's happening outside. So a lot of what is happening is also upstream in some catchment. Some of these catchments are not even within the countries that we are working in. So we also have to start looking at those things rather than just looking at what's happening nationally. Yeah? Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Julie. Yes, you talked about issues of scale, right? The cross-border, the source-to-sea issues as well, and that connectivity. But I think one of the things that's important as well, and it goes back to the question that was asked earlier on, which was that you're also pointing out that there is a rural immediate reliance in Africa on freshwater ecosystems, but there's also an urban indirect reliance on freshwater ecosystems, because the further those systems are degraded, the further local people are affected, but also the system is affected as well of society at large. So I think there are some key points in here. I'll just see if there's any questions we've got from the audience before we carry on with a few more. Does anybody want to raise a hand? Yeah, question at the back there, please, if we can get a mic. Donnie? Could you say your name and which organisation you're from, and if you have a particular question for a panelist or just generally?
Hi, can you hear me? Is this working? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, my name is Hannah Oh. I'm from Bayer, crop science, pharmaceuticals and consumer company. I have a general question when it comes to connecting the previous also session with the panel here. I'm a firm believer that I think, Mark, you mentioned about data. So I'm curious, how do you actually use data to measure the progress towards really conserving biodiversity? I think there's some learnings that we could tap onto with biodiversity, forest biodiversity, where they actually made a biodiversity sale of the credits. Is that some path that we can use digital technologies and data to really adopt that in the freshwater biodiversity context?
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Good question. Anybody else got a question at the moment? Yes, please, just a bit further down. Just hold that thought, Mark, before we come back to it.
Yeah, thank you. Is it working? Yeah, perfect. I'm Ala Al-Dweri, and I work as a research coordinator with the Technical University of Munich. Hi, James.
Hi.
My question is, Dominic, you said that for us to have a proper implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, it's quite important to start the authorization process and do this on a country level. And then Mark mentioned the importance of collective action and more or less and the importance of an inclusive language. And I'm just wondering, how would you go about doing that if you want to do this authorization or this cascading effect while making sure that you're doing that in a collective and inclusive way?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We'll take one more if there is. Question? There's a question at the back, and then we'll go to online. Right at the back.
Thank you. Am I audible? Okay. Thank you for your insightful input, and it's great to hear freshwater ecosystem and everything. But I have one question. It's very sectoral and very specific in terms of groundwater. So as we are talking about freshwater ecosystem, are we also including groundwater, or how is it incorporated in the whole mechanism of biodiversity conservation here? Thank you.
Great, that's a very good point. And then we'll just take one question here that's coming from online.
This question is from Jill Raval. The question is, what do you think the private sector can do to bridge this gap in terms of funding projects that go beyond addressing water risks in their own value chain?
Okay, great. Good question from Jill. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go back to the panel then. So let's go back to the first question, because Mark, you've had the longest time to prepare for it. So how to use data to measure progress, and are they learning from biodiversity forests with credits? And is that something that's maybe a way of using data to monetize protection effectively?
I'm not going to answer that question.
Okay.
No, actually, I'll have a go, but I want to start with question 2, the question about collective action.
Yeah.
Because that should lead us to how do we seize the potential across sectors and constituencies of integrating our data, right? So, in terms of how the question was around how do we really operationalize this call that I'm making for collective action-centered strategy and inclusive action. And I want to give one example of that, which is work. IMI has a program in Pakistan. We run several big projects there that are addressing water productivity and irrigation, water management in drylands, water governance and climate adaptation, and so on. And actually, in response to the floods in Pakistan a year ago now, there's quite a lot of momentum being built for major new investments in restoration of the Indus River. And so we, as a more water management focused institution, we've been called into that work to bring to bear in those strategies for restoration or some restoration of the Indus, bring to bear the kinds of activities that we do in relation to agriculture, in relation to water governance, in relation to climate and information and so on. So it becomes part of the package, part of the dialogue. and to build that program, we need to develop that common language. So the question then that leads me to is, where are the platforms that will enable us to do that systematically across these conservation efforts in relation to the global biodiversity framework? How do we build in to the approaches that we're creating that kind of process? And then getting to the data question, as you do that, it should call upon a whole variety of different types of data, including conservation data and species data and climate information and water information and so on. And of course, we know that there's the data tools that we have available to us nowadays are revolutionizing the way we can use information in these kinds of in these kinds of activities and strategies. So with that collective action approach, perhaps we can, or strategies, perhaps we can do a better job more quickly at greater scale of integrating the kinds of conservation data that IUCN specializes in alongside the kind of data that's available from Earth observation platforms that we're building tools around for. At IMI we're working on a Africa continent-wide data system for water resources, alongside a whole host of partners, of course. So how do we bring those two together to help us make the kinds of innovations around finance that maybe the question is pointing towards? The intricacies of how we would learn from forests and biodiversity credits from forests, I'll have to leave that to you, James.
Great, thank you. Okay, no. So back to the sort of collective action model is not just about the stakeholders and the institutions. It's about layering the right data and building the right approaches and methods together rather than every community doing it alone for their own community. And that's a historical problem across, I'd say, water management and conservation generally. But let's just take this up then a little bit with the question about the role that private sector can do. So private sector thinks much more about delivery of its output or its outcome in terms of what it's trying to achieve. So it doesn't get too caught up with the nuances and the politics of which department and who does what and says what. It's more about what are we trying to achieve as a unit. So it can be very singularly minded, very focused on things. Is that something that can help here? Is that mentality something that we need to take more into water management and conservation in terms of getting the job done rather than worrying about how we do the job?
Tough question. As such, it's for you. No, well, joke aside, yes, we are focused on delivery, but the more we go, the more in the private sector we take a holistic, sustainable development approach. So yes, we stay focused as private operators, but any private activity, I suppose. And this relates back to what I meant with the need for, how can I say that, a well-balanced regulatory regime, including, by the way, data acquisitions, etc., that framework. From my practice, when you operate in a country where there is no such regulation, no data acquisition framework, etc., the thing you start with is at local scale to try and do some of it. You have a much more broader experience than I do. And so this is why, I mean, rather, if we want to reach scale, and we want to reach scale, we cannot simply rely on, say, ad hoc initiative taken at basin level or sub-basin, etc. We really need teeth to do that. And this is why I say, to relate to your question about the stakeholder dialogue and collective action, of course we need it, but again, I mean, someone needs to chair the process, and it needs to be a public actor to chair the process, because no other has the legitimacy to do that. This is why, I mean, we strongly believe in that, because that cascades down into precise targets for anyone, public and private alike. And the beauty of that is that, frankly, for a private sector representatives, the next step down is it is a matter of compliance, as simple as that. And believe you me, you want to be compliant with anything that you do, especially when you are a multinational. You strive for compliance in all the territories you operate in. And so this is a very, how can I say that, a strong instrument. This is why we call for, and again, it's not, we do not oppose the regulatory approach to the stakeholder dialogue and the collective approach. It's just that the two needs to happen together at some point. And ultimately, it is a matter of the functioning of representative democracy. It may be demanding. I don't know any country around the world where we are totally satisfied saying, look, in our country that works well, but it has to deliver. It has to strike the balance that we so desperately need. And then that gives us means of action in terms of the private sector. Once you know that, just one single thing, I mean, honestly, now in a large number of cities that I know of, development still consists in developing impervious surfaces and cutting the remaining trees. That's still the rule today. We need that to stop. And how do you want to stop that right now? Do you just want to tell, the municipalities, you're not doing good? I mean, we will put some kind of sunshine regulation, we will spot the green cities, etc. Yeah, well, you will always find some green cities, but what about the others? So I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. They're all very relevant points. So, Julie, let's go to you. Is there anything you want to add to those 2 points? But also, perhaps you want to come back on the question around groundwater and how that features within this space, because there are obviously groundwater-dependent ecosystems. Groundwater is part of the hydrological system, so of course it's critically important. But it also has a much greater connection to society because of the way people use it. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that.
Yeah, sure. Especially in the drylands. You find that a lot of them don't have the freshwater sources that we so much depend on. So groundwater then becomes essential for them. So in those communities, then groundwater is key. And then also don't forget, it's part of the water cycle. So it's something that we cannot really keep out of this equation. So groundwater is important either way. We have to consider it as we move along. Huh?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Julie. So we'll just see there's one question from here, and we'll do a quick sort of wrap up. Any more questions from the audience? No? Okay. So just in two lines from each of you, just what is it? What's the reform that would change water management to deliver better for freshwater biodiversity? We can make the arguments of why around that's important, but what's the sort of 2 things that tomorrow water management should do slightly differently? And we'll start with you, Julie, can we?
One, the budgets. When you look at the budgets at the national level, very little money is allocated to water management. So this, to water management and also to biodiversity. So that's one thing that needs to be considered, at least at national level. And then the 2 of them need to start speaking together. You find within, as I said before, environment is very different from water. So they're not talking together. So they need to come to the same table so that they are also speaking the same language. So those are the 2 things that I'd say are important at national level.
Great, thanks, Mark.
On the screen earlier on, there was a phrase on someone's slides that the NBSAPs need to have a whole-of-system approach. So let's do that. I would advocate doing that with a mission-driven approach, common set of missions that conservation and water management can align around. And then included in that alignment and convergence around missions should be budgets and finance, and get that side of the story working in alignment with all of this.
Great, thank you. And Dominique?
Yeah, I'd speak of targets for wetland restoration, concrete target at country level, because whenever, I mean, if you operate on your own site or a single site, you only have one stakeholder basically, and it's relatively easy to restore the wetlands you are impacting around the water intakes or around the water discharges. When you want to be much bigger than that, then one needs overarching targets.
Great, thank you very much. Excellent, great. Well, please join me in thanking the panel. Please take your seats and we'll just do a very short wrap up. So we've obviously covered quite a lot of ground over the course of the last hour and a half, so I'll try and do that a little bit of justice as much as I can. And I'd like to go back to a point actually that Joachim raised right at the beginning. He talked about integrated water resource management, which probably many of you in this room are familiar with, which was really a philosophy for how we should be managing water. And actually right back at the beginning of that philosophy, it really talks about mobilizing stakeholders and integrating water into sectoral change. It talks for mobilizing water for the greatest economic return, equity of access to water resources, and environmental sustainability. And I think we could probably all agree that we've tended, as human beings tend to do, focused on the economic return of water and not necessarily focus enough on equity and environment, given these are the repeated challenges that keep coming up. So I think IWRM then was probably the model for collective action that hasn't really happened yet. And I think we have to make sure that that mobilizes and delivers in the right way. And I think we're probably only at step one of that process, if I'm honest, despite the age of that framework. I think we also have to, we've had an amazing year for freshwater biodiversity for those people who are really involved in it in terms of being able to lobby, and you'd be surprised at how much lobbying has been going on for the last 5 years to get water clearly stated in that global biodiversity framework, which is baffling given that that's where many of us actually probably first connect with biodiversity in many ways, both freshwater and marine waters. But that's only the first step. That's only the beginning of trying to get freshwater biodiversity integrated with water management in a more seamless approach. I think a point that Dominique raised is that as general, we don't have enough debate and discussion on this topic about how to mobilize joint solutions. So we don't have enough engagement with multiple actors on this. We tend to keep these conversations within our own silos still, and we might occasionally peek into somebody else's conversation, but we don't actually easily collaborate as one on these topics. And I think at the moment, water's not very well understood within the sort of biodiversity sphere. We've heard from some great people today who really know it at depth, but behind them is a big community that's still very focused on terrestrial elements of biodiversity. And I think what we need to do is identify many, many more trade-offs as a consequence of water management, because the trade-offs we can flip into synergies and solutions, and they give us choice about how to do things. But I think we tend to just look at the big picture trade-offs, for example, with hydropower development in river basins, and we don't look at the multiple ways that we can develop energy systems that give us a possibility of how to take that forward. And then finally, Mark's point about language and communications is critical, right? We don't easily communicate and talk the same language. We don't easily do that within the water community. You know, WASH people have their own language, water resources have their own language, and everybody in between has a slightly different set of approaches. We don't equally have a common dictionary that allows us to deliver for improvements in water management and biodiversity conservation. And then I think the key point for Dominique, and it's funny because I've raised this before at Stockholm sessions, is regulation and reforming regulation and regulatory compliance and improving that at speed and scale, which is something that generally we are not very good at reforming. I'd be surprised at how many regulators are actually here at World Water Week, and those that are will probably be focused from a utility perspective on water utilities and flows for public water supply, and not as many here looking at broader water resource elements and how that needs a constant check and review and reform to improve the system. So as we develop new global targets, as Dominique was pointing out, the time it takes for us to transition those into actual best practice at the country level is too long. And that's why we are constantly on catch-up and constantly having to deliver new targets to delay the loss that we're seeing in freshwater biodiversity and freshwater ecosystems, you know, in terms of rivers that don't reach the sea and pollution and blocks on river systems that affect both people and nature in the same way. So with that, we have some challenges going forward. I believe there is a slide which has a QR code on it, which has some resources on it, which should hopefully... No? I think there was. Never mind. And there's a QR code on the slide, which should hopefully be coming up. And Robin's email address. And Robin, if you need further information or further comments or questions, please email Robin, whose email should be on the slide that isn't on the screen. There we go. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I know it's a Sunday afternoon, but have a good rest of your week.